Your system will always fail at the weakest point. And people always ask me, say, how do I know what the weakest point is? I say, you don't have to know. Your system will tell you. Because that's the thing that's going to fail. Okay? And it's a moving target, the weakest point. Once you fix the weakest point, something else becomes the weakest point. It's like a bottleneck. They're always moving around. Right? So system will always tell you. If you don't look out for it, you will know. And when things do fail, the damage is always, proportional to the cost or value, right? So the first thing to die would be your most expensive fish. If water gets on the floor, it goes towards your expensive carpet. Your nice Persian rug is the first thing that's going to get wet, and so on. Okay? So the damage will always be proportional to that. So if you always realize that's what's going to happen, we'll try to avoid it. And finally, the most important one, you never run out of things that can go wrong. Okay? So this is a constant battle. I've been doing it for 20 years. And I still get phone calls from my wife occasionally. Now they're very infrequent about something happening to my tank. Okay. So over the years, I've tried to take away as many of the problems that I've encountered or I've heard of people encountering. And now I can pretty much comfortably go away on vacation for a couple of weeks and not worry about my tank. So now that I've said it, I'll probably get a phone call from my wife right after this song, right? So let's take a look at some of these disasters. Okay, and these are the ones I happily stole from Reef Central. Okay, these were actual posts. I didn't edit any of these. Cut and paste job. All right, just to give you a flavor of the kind of things that I've seen over the years. And I apologize if this happens to be one of your posts. Okay. So this is somebody in December had to leave the aquarium for 3 weeks, and of course, stuff happened. His circulating pump got broken, and in a few days he lost all his inhabitants. Right? So this is just one example of kind of things that have happened to people. Here's another one here where his frag tank was a complete loss. He woke up in the morning, he found that the chain that was holding the light broke, smashed into the tank, so that caused the return pump and the skimmer pump to burn up. Okay, so he lost all his frags, not only his frags, he was holding frags for the club. Okay, and ultimately they were just there, destroyed everything. Okay, so once again, you can see a different kind of disaster here now, right? So this other guy here, he lost everything in a 65-gallon the other day. His coral was bleached. He tested the water. Everything was fine. Didn't check the temperature. The temperature got up to 90 degrees. Okay. So this last one here, somebody's tank developed a hairline crack, spilling water out of a 500-gallon tank. Okay. So these are the kind of things that can go wrong. And when you start looking at these things, you can think about these things and say, are they really accidents waiting to happen, or could we avoid them? Right, so as an engineer, I want to look at these things and say, hey, maybe these problems can be avoided, and how do I go about systematically looking at things to make sure I can avoid some of these problems? Right? Here's another example. Right? And again, if you've been in the hobby long enough, you can relate to all of these things. Okay? Somebody's RODI water was putting water into his tank, messed up the salinity of the tank. Okay? Things don't start up after failure, after electricity goes out, siphons don't break properly, and so on. So what do you learn from this? Well, this is from a famous book by Henry Petrosky. He's a civil engineer, and he basically analyzes big disasters like bridges collapsing, buildings collapsing, and so on. But this is a quote from there. So the concept of failure is essential to understanding engineering. So these failures, they do serve a purpose. Right? If we analyze why things happen, it gives us a good clue on how to try to avoid them. So first and foremost, what we have to do is try to obviate the failure. Okay? But it's even more important that we don't learn anything from the failures. Okay? So it's a bigger tragedy when the lessons of failure are understood and we allow them to happen again. and I see this in the reef hobby all the time. Right? Things go wrong, people fix it exactly the same way as they were before. Right? You're not learning from your mistakes. Okay, so we need to learn from our mistakes, learn from others' mistakes, and like I tell everyone, share your mistakes with everyone. Don't be embarrassed to say, this is what I did, and this is what happened. Okay, because every time you share these stories, somebody hopefully will learn something from them. So when you start looking at those lists of disasters that I showed you earlier, right? I started looking at saying, what are some of the common things in these disasters? Right? So what can I generalize from here? And one of the things you can generalize easily that there is a failure of some component occurring, right? Somebody's pump failed, somebody's heater failed, somebody's RODI unit had a float switch, the float switch failed, right? So there is at least a failure of one component, right? So what that tells me is that there's reliability of these components is an issue, right? So we can think about these and saying there are some failures that are going to occur because of reliability of components. Right? If you look at some of the other ones, there's a cascading effect of failures. These lights fell into the water came out, that burned up the pump, right? So there's not just one failure, but these one failure can then lead to multiple failures, right? So there's a cascading effect. There's a different time constant for different failures, right? If you have hairline crack in your tank, okay, that's going to happen slowly over time, the water will come out, or you could have a glass just burst, right? Things are going to happen very quickly. Temperature is heating up in your tank, your heater is stuck. It's not going to go up right away from 75 to 90 in 5 minutes. So you have a certain amount of window, okay, which I'm calling time constant for these different failures. Right? And then there's this idea of monitoring. Right? I can monitor these events, and if I'm constantly monitoring, then I may be able to catch these events as they occur. Okay, but none of us are constantly monitoring these things. Right? So there's a frequency of monitoring. You check once in a while, you check the temperature, it was okay, you come back from work, it's no longer okay. So your monitoring frequency was maybe a day there, pretty much. Right? But if you were checking it every hour, you may have caught it creeping up. Right? And the other one is that when we design any system, essentially what we're doing is making a whole bunch of decisions. Okay? And every time we make a decision, we're essentially taking a risk. And we need to be aware of, hey, I made this decision, what is the risk associated with making that decision? Right? So with that, we can start looking at some other key design principles and saying, okay, what do I draw from these failures? What do I draw from some of these similarities between the failures? And what kind of design principles should I be working with? So the first design principle is that every design is really a compromise. There's no such thing as a great design. We all have to work within constraints. Okay. So once you're working within constraints, you're essentially coming up with a compromise design. Right? So your constraints might be money. Somebody else may not have money constraints. Right? Your constraint could be space. Right? So you could put limited to work in this confined space, and then you have to design your whole system around that thing. Some people are worried more about aesthetics. My tank is in the basement, I don't care how it looks. I don't care how I scatter this stuff. But if it's sitting up in my living room, then I'm going to have to deal with a different set of constraints. It's got to look nice, it's got to fit in with the furniture, it's got to fit in with the decor of the house, right? So you have different constraints. If you're like me, that last constraint drives a lot of things. That's the WAF constraint. That's the wife acceptance factor constraint. Everything I do has to pass that constraint. Okay? It has to be acceptable to my wife. So these are the kind of constraints that we all have to work with. And when we work with a constrained system, essentially we have a compromise design. And within that design, I want to look at things like how can I improve the reliability of the system? How can I create my system so it's modular, so the subsystems are independent, so I can avoid some of this cascading effects of failures. Okay. I don't want my light breaks. I don't want my water pumps to die, right? So there is this cascade. There's this connection between these failures. So if I keep them modular, keep them separate, then I can keep my systems independent. Right? Embodied principles are what I call defensive design. Anticipate the failures, admit that they're going to happen, and when they happen, try to limit the damage that they can cause. Right? Stick to the KISS principle. That doesn't mean keep kissing your wife to get the things done and approved, but keep it simple. Right? So these are some higher level guidelines you want to look at, like design for maintainability. Oftentimes I've seen systems designed, and I've designed them myself, where I don't think about how I'm going to maintain this system. I know things are going to go wrong, but I maintain this. Okay? The older I get, the more important that's become. Because when I was younger, I could squeeze myself into tight spaces and work on things. Now I can't. Okay, so you think about designing the system so you can actually maintain them.